So you can see the screen, right?
Yes, sir, I can see it.
Okay, right. So yesterday we discussed about an overall understanding over solution architecture, like what solution architecture is all about, in what way enterprise architecture is something connecting to that. Because there are two things. One is about enterprise architecture, which focuses more on business side, systems, applications, and as well as data. Now, when it comes to solution architect side, which majorly focusing on the solution of the application, whatever the application solution is required, that is something relating to that stuff. Now, these are the different type of architectures, whatever you can see here, because in the field of IT, whenever we work, because people have different apprehensions over the architecture. Hence, I'm different sort of architectures which are uh, available in the application development. So these are the different type of architectures we have. One is business side, and second was developer side. Third is vendor and operation side. Business side architectures are majorly business architecture, as I told you yesterday. Business perspective, right? So about the kind of business goals, objectives, all these were comes under the business side. At the same time, enterprise side, even enterprise architecture, as I told you, all these are comes under the business. So these architectures exclusively focuses on the functional aspects of the business, right? What are the functional areas which business operates? This is all something comes under that category. The next was developer focused. Developer focused means like development side. I'm trying to say, right? So because uh, development means when we are going to develop any solutions for the project, and whatever the kind of applications we are developing, data architecture, all these things are comes under developer focused. So this is the second area. Whatever the development are we going to do, whatever the application development are we focusing on, all these are comes under developer focused. Software architecture, application architecture, data architecture, all these things are comes under the developer focused. Means development team, because technically whatever the code we supposed to work, whatever the code we supposed to write, everything is comes under the developer focused point of view. Software architecture, application architecture, right? So how data is being connected with all these things. Whereas the third one about operational focused. Operational focused means to operate solution or to operate an application. Whatever is required for every application, there is a security is needed, because for every application to protect the data against to the malwares, all that, right? So we have to manage security. So security architecture is also one of the key element. Followed by this network architecture, because how network will be built for any application that is required. Next, cloud architecture, because now whenever we are moving towards a cloud environment, because nowadays most of the applications we are transforming to the cloud environment. This is where generally cloud architecture come into picture. But here there is a point to understand the kind of services we opt in cloud, because normally as far as the services of cloud will be of three different types. One is public cloud services, second is private cloud, and third is hybrid cloud. Public cloud services means this is a basic cloud services where anyone can use those services. So there is no specific infrastructure or there is no specific platform creates by the cloud service provider. So where whatever the regular services whichever are providing under cloud, either it can be infrastructure if we want, or software or application platform, everything can be utilized by us. But whereas when it comes to the private cloud, means private cloud services are exclusively relating to the what we call exclusive relating to the particular services which customer is expecting, so that we require an exclusive team of people who understand the requirements, whoever develops the cloud architecture for a particular customer. This is where private cloud services are, which are premium, honestly, which are premium in cost. Private cloud services are comes under that category. Next is hybrid cloud. Hybrid cloud means it's both combination of public followed by private. So these are the three different services which cloud provides. So if you are focusing on the public cloud area, let's say an application we are developing from the cloud perspective, whatever the regular services provided by the service provider, either it can be an AWS or it can be Azure or of anything, Google Cloud, IBM, whatever it was. So end of the day, this is all something which we need to understand from the context of this type of services we are opting for. Okay. So because some people will go for platform, right? Some people will utilize services relating to software. Some people utilize services relating to the infrastructure, because AWS is a cloud service provider uh, who are majorly prominent in infrastructure services domain, because different EC2 infrastructure labels, everything will be provided by them. This is where infrastructure services come into picture. Next was platform and software, because whatever the platform we required for an application to create, at the same time, whatever the software services which are essentially required for us to develop, because what are the different software services, everything comes under that category. So this is where generally cloud architecture. End of the day, if it's an on-premise application, we don't require cloud services. Whenever we are moving towards the cloud environment, this cloud architecture, everything come into picture. Next one about vendor side. Vendor side means whatever are we developing. Let's say we are developing an application for one of our customer who is from the banking side, let's say, right? So we are developing a core banking application for the customer. So by considering the business area, by considering the operational side, we have to provide instructions to the development team to provide solutions for the project. Whatever the project we are going to provide, so we need to provide solutions for that. That's the reason why whenever we are working on the solutions, especially irrespective of the domain we belongs to, either it can be banking, it can be healthcare, or whatever the services are we opting for. Normally, there will be a software architecture which is essentially important. Software architecture, right? Because building software architecture is something which is required. This is where we also calls as software system, right? So because the software system have multiple areas, right? So because when you see the software system, let me write on here. Will you make a note of the points, or do you want me to write here, Surinder?
Yeah, I think I can also make the point.
Okay, right. So if it is been a software system, whenever we are developing in software architecture, when you talk about a software system, normally this software system consists of, one is about containers. Of course, nowadays we are using Docker and all everything. As we are moving towards DevOps environment, we are using a tool called Docker for container purpose, all that.
Yeah, that contains like all the basic like OS, application,
Yes,
everything, right?
yeah, right. So applications, right? So data storage, right? So all that data stores, etc. Right. So this is where generally container all about, right? So this container contains components. Okay, container components. These components can be one or multiple because depends on the services whatever we are offering. So the amount of components we are implementing to develop the project. This is where, if you remember, yesterday I told you, concept of microservices came into existence because earlier, what are the applications we are using for a very long time were completely monolithic approach based applications. So when we see about monolithic approach, whatever the components were using by us in application, everything was tightly coupled. So that if there is any changes to be made in a particular component, that would be difficult. That's how the situation earlier. But nowadays, whatever the components, whatever the services we require, for everything we are creating an exclusive microservices as separate, isn't it? Right, Surinder? Right? Surinder, are
Correct,
you
sir.
there?
Yeah.
Right. So this is where generally, when we talk about the components and all that, whatever the components are we creating, whatever the components uh, we want to create. So these components can be one or many, especially, right? So nowadays, this component can be created. And if there are any changes to be made to the existing component, that can be done when and wherever it is needed, so that it won't get affected on the regular day-to-day operations of the application, which is being used by the users, all that. Now, these components implemented by code elements. So this is where being into development, we do that, right? So whatever the classes, objects like interfaces, functions, right? So all these things are being used on the code elements parts. So all these will be performed by people. Understood? Clear, right? So this is where generally a software system will be majorly used for. Now, but whenever we are developing a software system, especially under development perspective, before we were going towards the solution architecture, it is always important for us to understand about how complex the systems are, because system complexity varies, depends on the type of application it belongs to. At the same time, size of the application will also be varied sometimes, right? So there either it can be of that or it can be of this. So whenever we are developing a solution architecture, because building a context view, which majorly responsibility for a solution architect, because if you want to become a solution architect, whenever we are developing solution architecture for any of the application, first of all, we should understand the context view, because under what context the application are we developing? This context again will be considered two things. One is about the business context and second is about the technical context. Business context based upon the business functionalities as well as the business process flows, whatever an organization is performing, which is something connecting to the solution, what is that we are about to develop. Second is a technical context. Technical context means, is it that application we are developing from the scratch? Then the approach will be of different.
Okay.
Or else are these projects are migrating projects, because there are three kinds. Whenever we works on the application, three kind of projects we normally get. One is migration projects. Migration projects means yesterday we discussed about that, right? So
Yeah,
there is
from
legacy
on-premises to
applications. From
like
legacy
cloud or
applications to the new applications we transform, where data migrations must be taken place by implementing ETL process, etc.
okay.
Second is an application was existed already, wherein we want to add some new components to the existing ones. This is second category.
Mhm.
Understood? Clear, Surendra.
Right.
This is
Yeah, like
second category.
normal
Assume that, for
development.
example, let me give you an example from the healthcare point of view. Because as you are from the healthcare domain, let me give you an example from the healthcare point of view. Let's say a provider nothing but a hospital,
Mhm.
provide a treatment for a particular patient, wherein against to that, they have to raise the claim request to the payer. Usually they will send details to the payer. Payer means either it can be a private entity, a private insurance companies, or it can be a public entity called CMS, because especially in US, we have CMS, right? So Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services.
Mhm.
So this Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services is a government entity which manages whatever the health insurance claims received from the provider. Means because we have two different plans like Medicare, Medicaid, all that. Two different plans we have. These two, because Medicare is a standard plan. But whereas when it comes to Medicaid is a plan which is exclusively for low income group people, where there are some changes happen sometimes because it is being under the control over the state government. State to state, whatever the facilities they will be providing under Medicaid is different. But when it comes to Medicare, it's just a standard for across all the states. Now, when a particular person has undergone the treatment at the hospital, against to that, there will be against to that, a claim will be raised by the provider to the payer. So for that, there are some systems usually in the field of healthcare we use. This is what generally we call it as claim systems. I think you might be heard about it. Claim processing systems like healthcare core administration applications like Facets, QNext, HealthEdge, right? So different
Mhm.
applications we use. Remember, these are the applications which are used for the core healthcare administration process. And these applications were standard. These applications you don't see any change in these applications because these applications, whatever the components which are involved in it, and whatever are we developing remains constant, that never change. But assume that there are some changes happens in the Medicare plan. For example, Medicaid plan, sorry. There are some changes happens on the Medicaid plan in terms of the eligibility or in terms of the additional services which a state government has proposed to provide. So necessary modifications and as well as the changes. At the same time, one more example I can give. Let's say, for example, earlier we don't have any service in terms of the reimbursement for the COVID treatment because we never thought of. But what happened now, after post-COVID, you see healthcare organizations, health insurance companies were coming up with some a particular separate code even for COVID treatment. Why? Because it was not there earlier. There are some modifications which has to be made due to the government mandates. This has to be changed in the business rules of the organization. Subsequently, those changes has to be done in the applications. Understood, Surendra?
Yes, sir.
Listening?
Yes.
Right? So means there is an existing application. It
Mhm.
means we require some changes to be made into the existing application.
Got it.
Whatever the application we have, we want to make some changes in the existing application. Means you are not developing an application from the scratch. You are making necessary changes in the existing application by adding new services to that. So this is the second area, second type of projects which normally we work for. The third projects were applications which we are developing from the scratch. Am I right or not? Understood.
Right. Yeah.
Surinder,
Like
right?
three
So these are the
categories.
three areas. One is migration projects. Second, existing application here. We are upgrading this to the next level. The third sort of applications where we are developing it from the scratch. Understood or not? Right?
Understood,
So
sir.
these are the
Yes.
three major services which we provide for the customer. Of course, depends on the size and complexity of the project on it. So if we being a solution architect, whenever we are trying to understand all this, the very first thing we need to understand the context view. So under what context, what could be the business context of the customer? What is that they were expecting? At the same time, we have to see the technical context also. What is the technical context which is behind of it? Technical context, either what sort of application are we developing, and what type of services and solutions a customer is expecting us to develop. So this will help software solution architects to understand what is more important in terms of the visualization, which is based upon the request of the business need, which customer has given all these. So by considering the size and as well as complexity of the project, which normally we need to develop, being a solution architect, we need to focus on C4 model. Yesterday, I have given you detail about C4 model, right? So C4 model is what generally we use. C4 model as follows. Did I explain you about C4 model in detail yesterday or
Mm,
only a high level view?
Only a high level, I think, sir.
Okay, right.
Yeah.
So, yeah, coming back. So this is where generally C4 model stands for, right? So C4 model is what one of the I can say an approach. Right? So C4 model is an approach which normally will be taken into consideration being a solution architect whenever we are going to develop that
Okay.
solution for a project. So when we talk about C4 model, C stands for context. Next, C stands for containers.
Okay.
C stands for components. Next stands for code. Okay, this is where generally C4 model stands for. C stands for context.
Context,
C stands
containers.
for containers. C stands for components. C stands for code. Okay. So now, right. So context means this is where generally we call it a system context diagram. This is where we call it as system context diagram, right? So system context diagram. Now, what system context diagram will be useful for what purpose? Generally, system context diagram is being provided, right? So this will be helpful in providing a starting point which shows how the software system in scope fits into the application. This is where generally system context diagram is being used for, right? So
So
context,
very high level diagram, sir.
absolutely high level approach over the solution. What is that we want to develop? Because there are both functional and non-functional aspects has to be considered. because functional aspects of the application are involved in it. At the same time, non-functional aspects were also, because performance, scalability, reachability, availability, maintainability, right? So load balancing, right? So fault tolerancing, right? So we need to consider everything
Non-functional.
when we are developing the solution. This is not something how beautifully user interface designs we have created. Of course, it is important how uh, beautifully these things are created. It's important, but whenever we work for some commercial application, this is required. Because let's say, for example, we are developing an e-commerce portal or travel domains, all that, right? Whenever we are working on user interfaces and user experience will be the highest priority. But whenever you are using some applications which is internal, right? So either it can be banking, financial applications, or healthcare applications. Apart from all, they require an application which must be secure. Which must be secure, right? So security is the highest priority, especially for these applications. At the same time, application has to be performed well, so that whatever the quality of time an end user is spending on to perform their operational activities, right? So their business activities will come down. When it will happen, when the application performance is more, then only it is happen. So we need to understand in high level understanding over the system context diagram, which is majorly helpful for us in providing a starting point where and how this software system will of the scope nothing but the kind of possibility what we have will be fitted into the application. This is where generally system context diagram is being useful. The next one about containers, right? So this is where generally container stands for. This is where we call it as container diagram. This is where we call it as container diagram. Of course, nowadays for containers, as I told you, right? So because whenever we are moving towards DevOps environment, Docker, etc., all these were containers. But if it was not DevOps environment, because we cannot guarantee that all the applications will be used, teams will be used DevOps platform in 100%, because there are possibilities sometimes which still we were moving on the traditional approaches for a very long time. Whenever we try to understand about this container diagrams and all, which majorly focuses on the software system scope and shows the high-level technical building blocks. Right? So this is where generally this container diagrams are majorly useful for. Right? So whenever we are developing this C4 model, when it comes to the container diagram, which majorly focusing on the kind of software systems as well as the kind of scope of how shows the high level technical building blocks is what comes under container diagram. The third one about components, right? So this is where generally components comes into picture. This is where generally we call it as component diagram stands for. Component diagram stands for. So it focus more on the individual focus more on the individual container and showing the component inside that. This is where generally component diagram come into picture. Means whatever the components are we using, right? So different components in terms of the services, whatever we are using. So generally, component diagram is majorly focused, like where more focus on the individual containers, where we are showing the components inside, right? So all these things are comes under the component diagram. The next diagram is called code diagram. This is also, we call it as class diagram, also called as
Class diagram.
class
Okay.
diagram. So this class diagram focus into
It's a very low level, right?
absolutely
So
right, low level,
okay.
whatever whatever the components we are being
How
implemented,
the classes are
classes,
interacting.
objects, right,
Okay.
instances, functions, right? So all these things are comes under this category. Okay, focuses into a individual component. Which shows what is that internally we need to develop. Understood? Clear? Right?
So yeah.
Right. So these are the 4 different aspects which are comes under C4. Right. So this is where generally we call it a C4 model stands for. So if we being a solution architect, whenever we are going to develop in high level understanding as well as the detailed understanding over the solution in real world, C4 model is one which normally we use, where which focuses more on the system context, where it give you a high level understanding over how the solution are we going to develop and how this software system can be fitted into the existing application. Because if it deviates, whatever the scope we have identified will be deviated, right? So scope, this is where generally we call it a scope creep, right? So scope creep we call it as. This is where one point. Second is container diagrams, followed by the component diagrams, followed by class diagrams. So these are the 4 areas which are comes under the solution architect. Because being a solution architect, whenever we are developing solutions and all, wherein we need to create a technical roadmap. Because generally roadmaps we know, because especially when we are working on the agile environment, we will be knowing about the roadmaps. Because functionally roadmaps are different. But whereas when it comes to the technical roadmap must be consisting of the application what we are developing on a high level note, including the detail aspects of the containers, whatever are we using, by considering the technical building blocks, whatever we need to create, micro level understanding over the components, whatever the different components are we using. At the same time, in that component, what code are we developing in, right? So what are the classes, instances, objects, right? So functions are we developing? All these things should explain from the visual point of view. This is where generally technical roadmap come into picture. So for that, this is always important for us to explain about the logical view of the system, because logical view is one of the prime aspect behind developing the technicality of the application. So understanding the logical view, because end of the day, being a developer has to be focused on the logical aspect, right? So because when we are writing the program, it's always focused on the logical point of view, right? So how and what logic are we implementing to explain that particular functionality so that customer can use it without having any toughness, right? So this is where it was. So this is where generally we need to perform in reference to the types of architectures, whatever I have explained you so far, right? So here, right? So this is where the solution architect and all everything come into picture. Now,
Okay.
if you are focusing on the cloud environment, let's say for example, solution architect we are, and expertise from the point of cloud environment and all, wherein we need to create different CI and CD pipelines, all that is required. Because if it was not a cloud application, let's say, because there are two things we need to understand. One is if it's in an on-premise solutions we are developing, wherein you may not be having any CI CD approach, etc. Right? So we don't have all that. But whenever we are implementing, whenever we are involving DevOps environment into the existing environment, wherein by developing cloud applications, at the same time by we are practicing DevOps environment in the application front. It's always important for a solution architect to design, build different CI and CD pipelines. This is where generally it is required. Right? So if it is cloud, right, either it can be AWS or it can be Azure, right? So whatever the cloud service providers we use, either it can be Google Cloud or IBM, right? So whichever the cloud service provider, end of the day, design and build CI/CD pipelines is one of the key and prominent aspect. Being a solution architect, we have to be good with. Understood? Next, in top of all that, being a solution architect, we have to be focused on the governing process, because for every architecture and whatever the solutions are we going to develop, for this generally there will be an architectural governance process which is something involved in it. So understanding about the governance process is required, because governance process is an administrative activity of how this can be implemented, what kind of quality standards we have to initiate in order to make it more 100% successful. This is where generally governance process will be majorly used of. So the governance process, understanding about the governance process of the architecture is also one of the key and important element whenever we are developing the solution for any of the project, because utmost maintainability over the regulatory standards, policies and procedures are important to provide a quality output for the customer. So this is where generally the different type of architectures, technical architecture anyway, you know, right? So understanding about the technicalities of the application. So these are the aspects which comes under the application development, especially from the context of solution architect. This is what the approach is all about. Clear to you?
Yes.
Right? So can you please rejoin again?
Yes, sure.